He only wanted the papers signed by Friday. Miriam Okonkwo Baxter found the envelope on the kitchen counter, propped against the fruit bowl like it was nothing, like it was a hydro bill or a parking notice. Her name was printed on the front in the clean, indifferent font of a legal firm she didn't recognize. She stood in her coat, keys still in her hand, groceries cutting into her wrist, and read the return address twice. She didn't open it right away. She set the bags down. She put the kettle on. She stood at the window and watched a crow land on the back fence and then leave, which felt, in that moment, like the saddest thing she had ever seen. The papers were 12 pages. She read them standing at the counter, because she couldn't bring herself to sit. Warren hadn't told her he'd already hired someone. 14 years. 14 years of early mornings and late dinners and weekends visiting his mother in Oakville. 14 years of rearranging her own career around his, of smiling at his colleagues at firm dinners and laughing at jokes she didn't find funny, of choosing the house in Westdale because it was close to his office, of learning to make the lamb the exact way he liked it. 14 years that had apparently been quietly, methodically, legally dissolved while she was at the grocery store buying the ingredients for dinner. She called him. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting. "I'm in a meeting," he said. "You had me served, Warren." A pause. Not long enough to suggest he felt anything about it. "My lawyer advised it. It's cleaner." "Cleaner," she repeated. Miriam. His voice had that careful, measured tone she'd come to recognize over the years. The one he used when he wanted her to understand that further discussion was not an option. "We've been through this. It's time." She wanted to say something that would crack that composure. She wanted to say something that would make him feel, for just 1 second, the vertigo she was standing inside of. Instead, she said, "Fine," because she was 39 years old and exhausted, and she didn't know how to fight someone who had already decided the fight was over. She signed the papers on a Tuesday. Her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Easy, who smelled like good coffee and spoke with the calm efficiency of someone who had guided hundreds of women through exactly this doorway, pointed to each line without commentary. Miriam's hand was steady, which surprised her. She'd expected it to shake. Outside the office, standing on King Street in the January cold with cars hissing past on wet pavement, she put her sunglasses on even though the sky was flat gray, and she cried. Not the elegant, quiet kind. The ugly kind. The kind where you have to press your back against a brick wall because your legs aren't cooperating. A woman walked past and glanced at her and kept walking. That was the thing about the city. It held all of it and just kept going. What she didn't know, standing there on King Street, was that she was 6 weeks pregnant. She found out 3 weeks later at a walk-in clinic in Barton Village, because her own doctor had a 2-week wait. She sat on the paper-covered examination table, and the nurse practitioner said the words, and Miriam just looked at the wall for a long moment, at the poster about hand washing, and thought about all the impossible things that were now true at the same time. She'd spent the last 4 years believing she couldn't. Tests and referrals, and the particular grief of sitting in waiting rooms with numbered tickets, of Warren squeezing her hand in that way that felt, toward the end, more like impatience than comfort. They'd been through 2 rounds of treatment. He'd said, the last time, that maybe it just wasn't meant to be. She'd heard, "I've stopped wanting this." And now, she drove home on the link and pulled into the driveway and sat in the parked car for a long time. The engine ticked as it cooled. She put her hand on her stomach, which was exactly the same as it had always been, and felt something shift. Not physically, but somewhere underneath everything. Some tectonic plate she hadn't known was loose. She was keeping it. She didn't deliberate, she just knew. She told no one for 2 months. Not her sister Becca in Vancouver, not her friend Josephine. Wait, not that name. Her friend Tamura, who would have been kind about it, and then immediately told 3 other people. She went to her appointments alone. She ate crackers in the car before client meetings, because the nausea came in at 10 every morning like clockwork. She let out the waistbands of her work trousers and told her project manager she'd switched to high-waisted cuts. It wasn't exactly lying. Warren, during this time, was photographed at a fundraising gala in Toronto with a woman named Sasha Elroy. Miriam didn't look her up. She started to once, and then closed the browser. Some information was just gasoline. Her work? She was a heritage conservation consultant, which meant she spent her days arguing for the preservation of buildings that no one else thought mattered yet. Kept her sane. She liked the clarity of it. A building either had structural integrity or it didn't. The bones were either worth saving or they weren't. You could make a case. You could document it, photograph it, present the evidence. The decision had to go somewhere. Her life right now did not have that quality. At 16 weeks, she told Becca over FaceTime. Becca cried immediately and without apology and said, "Oh, Mir," in a voice that broke Miriam wide open in a way she hadn't allowed herself yet. She cried with her sister for a long time. After, she felt lighter. Not fixed, lighter. It was Becca who asked eventually whether Warren knew. "No," Miriam said. "Are you going to tell him?" She thought about the envelope on the kitchen counter. She thought about the word cleaner. She thought about sitting in waiting rooms with a numbered ticket while he checked his phone. "No," she said again. Becca didn't argue. That was why Miriam loved her. She stayed in the Westdale house. It was hers. The settlement had been straightforward on that point. Patricia Eze had made sure of it, and she slowly, over the months that followed, let herself stop pretending it was temporary. She painted the second bedroom, a warm cream, not the blinding white Warren had preferred for everything. She bought a second-hand rocking chair from a shop on Lock Street and refinished it in her backyard over a weekend in April, kneeling on the patio stones in old jeans, sanding in long, slow strokes while the neighbor's dog watched her through the fence with deep seriousness. She started to feel like herself again, which surprised her every time. She'd been so certain that leaving, being left, would hollow her out permanently. Instead, it was more like how a building looks after the scaffolding comes down. Smaller than you expected, maybe. But the actual structure. Warren found out about the pregnancy through a mutual acquaintance in May. She was 7 months along by then. He called her on a Sunday morning, and she could tell from the first syllable that he'd had time to think about what he wanted to say, which meant what he actually felt had been sanded away and finished and presented. "I heard," he said. She waited. "Is it mine?" She said yes, because it was, and because lying about that would have made her someone she didn't want to be, and because she'd already consulted with Patricia about exactly this moment. He was quiet. Then, "We should talk about what this means." "It means I'm having a baby in 8 weeks, she said. "What it means beyond that is something I'm happy to address through our lawyers." She had never, in 14 years, spoken to Warren Baxter like that. He came back over the following weeks with proposals, a co-parenting arrangement, his name on the birth certificate, his involvement, his rights. His lawyer sending letters that Patricia received and summarized for her in their Tuesday calls, with a composure that Miriam was beginning to understand, was a kind of professional mercy. She wasn't trying to erase him. She simply wasn't going to let him reorganize this into something that worked for him, the way she'd let him reorganize everything else. Her daughter was born on a Thursday in June, just after 4 a.m., in a room at St. Joseph's with a midwife named Donna who had the steady, matter-of-fact warmth of someone who had been doing this work for 20 years and found it no less remarkable for that. Miriam's sister flew in from Vancouver and was there and held her hand and said, "You're doing so well at intervals that somehow never stopped meaning something." Everly. She'd had the name since February, written in a notebook on her nightstand without any ceremony, just certain. Everly, Jean Okonkwo Baxter. She lay in the hospital bed afterward, her daughter on her chest, this 7-pound fact of a person who smelled like something she didn't have a word for, and the exhaustion was total, and the feeling underneath the exhaustion was something she also didn't have a word for. Not happiness, exactly. Bigger than happiness. More structural. Becca took a photo and Miriam looked at it later in the dim quiet of 6 a.m. and thought, "I don't look like someone whose life fell apart. I look like someone whose life started." The complications with Warren began in August. His lawyer had filed, while she was still on parental leave and operating on 4 hours of sleep and the specific cognitive fog of new parenthood, for formal access arrangements. And this was the part that landed like cold water, a petition to revisit certain assets in the original settlement, citing his status as the biological father of a dependent child. She called Patricia on a Tuesday evening, with Everly asleep on her shoulder, and her voice completely flat, which she'd learned was what she sounded like when she was frightened. Patricia was unruffled. "He's testing what will move." We respond clearly and we don't overreact. You're on solid ground. Then why does it feel like the ground is moving? Because you're tired and you're doing this alone, and he has resources, and those things are real. But so is your settlement. So is your address. So is your documented contribution to the marital estate. A pause. And so is the fact that he left. She sat with that for a while after she hung up. It was Tamara who introduced her to Elliot Hardcastle. She almost hadn't gone to the dinner party. Everly had been up twice the night before, and Miriam had spent the afternoon convincing herself that social interaction with humans who slept through the night was beyond her current capacity. But Tamara had said, "It's just 6 people. We're doing the lamb thing from that cookbook, and you need to leave the house." And Miriam had gone, because Tamara had a way of making staying home feel like cowardice. Elliot Hardcastle was already there when she arrived, standing in Tamara's kitchen holding a glass of red wine and saying something that made the man next to him laugh. He was tall, with the kind of posture that suggested he'd been told as a child to stand asht and had actually listened. She registered him the way you register the weather. "It's there, it's fine, you carry on." They ended up seated across from each other at dinner. He was careful, she noticed, in the way he asked questions. Not performative. He actually waited for the answers. He worked in infrastructure, bridges and transit systems, the unglamorous architecture of how cities function. And when he found out what she did, he said, "Heritage conservation. That's interesting." And she waited for the follow-up that was really about something else, which was usually what happened. And instead he said, "What do you think the strongest argument is for preserving something that the markets decided has run its course?" She talked for 7 minutes about a textile mill in Dundas that she was currently fighting for. He listened the entire time. She realized, somewhere in those 7 minutes, that she hadn't talked that much in one stretch since before Everly was born. Tamara caught her eye from the other end of the table and made a face that Miriam pointedly ignored. He asked for her number at the end of the night. She gave it to him, and then sat in her car in Tamara's driveway for a full minute thinking about whether that had been a good idea, and then drove home. He texted the next day. Not at night, which she noticed. A normal hour, no pressure in the phrasing. He asked if she wanted to get coffee sometime, and said he understood if she was busy. She was busy. She was busier than she had been at any point in her adult life. She said yes. They met at a place on James Street North on a Saturday morning in October, while Becca, who had extended her visit in a way that neither of them had formally acknowledged was indefinite, had Everly. The coffee was good, and the conversation was better, and she was home by noon, and she sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of Everly's nap and thought about how strange it was to feel, for 2 hours, like just a person again. Not a mother, not a litigant, not an ex-wife. Just a person sitting across from another person. She told him about Warren over their third coffee. Not everything, the shape of it. He listened without performing the correct expressions, which she appreciated more than she could explain. "Are you doing okay with all of it?" he asked. She thought about it. Actually thought about it instead of producing the answer she usually gave. "I'm doing better than I expected," she said. "Which is different from okay." "Yeah," he said. "That makes sense." She didn't think she was falling for him, or she thought she wasn't, and then noticed she was. Warren's legal activity intensified in November. The asset challenge moved forward. His lawyer claimed that Miriam's failure to disclose the pregnancy during the divorce proceedings constituted material omission relevant to the settlement terms. It was, Patricia said, a long shot that was designed to be expensive rather than winnable, to drain resources and time until she agreed to terms that were more favorable to him. "He's punishing you," Becca said in the kitchen one evening. "I know," Miriam said, "for not telling him, for having a life he doesn't control anymore." She went to bed that night and lay in the dark, listening to the baby monitor, and thought about Warren. Not with anger, exactly, with a kind of clarity. She could see him very clearly now from this distance. The way he had always operated in this same mode, finding the edge of what someone would accept and pressing just past it. She'd spent 14 years adjusting, moving the line, telling herself that was just how things worked in a life with another person. It wasn't. She'd just been very patient, and he'd mistaken that for permanence. Elliot found out about the legal situation in December when she had to cancel dinner because the filing had come in that afternoon, and she'd spent 3 hours on the phone with Patricia and was in no state for a restaurant. She texted him to apologize. He called instead of texting back, which was the right call, and she found herself telling him more than she'd planned to. He was quiet for a moment when she finished. "Then do you want company or do you want space?" She said space, which was the honest answer, and he said, "Okay, call me if that changes." And he meant it, which she knew because he didn't follow up 6 times, and he wasn't cold when she saw him 2 weeks later. It was in that 2-week window that Elliot quietly retained, through his own lawyer, a third-party property assessor to independently document the market value of 3 assets Warren was disputing. He did not tell her he'd done this. He gave Patricia's office the report, which was thorough and sourced and left very little room for disagreement, and Patricia told Miriam about it at their next meeting in that same tone of efficient calm. Miriam stared at the file. "He did this himself?" "His lawyer reached out to mine," Patricia said. "He said, and I'm quoting here, that the only thing he was interested in was making sure you had what you were entitled to." She drove home and sat in the driveway and called Elliot. "You didn't tell me," she said. "You had enough to think about. Not defensive, just explanatory."
"Elliot!"
She didn't know what she wanted to say. She said thank you, which was not adequate but was what she had. The case didn't collapse immediately. These things never do. But Patricia, with the independent assessment in hand, was able to challenge the filing at a scheduling hearing in January, and the judge, a woman with excellent posture and reading glasses on a chain, dismissed the disputed asset challenge with what Patricia described as brisk impatience. Warren's lawyer, according to Patricia, had gone very still when the ruling came down. Warren called Miriam that evening. She almost didn't answer. "You won," he said. "I maintained what was mine," she said. Another pause, different from the earlier ones, less controlled. "She's my daughter, Miriam." "Yes, she is. And when you're ready to be in her life the way she deserves, not as a legal strategy, your lawyer can call Patricia and we'll arrange something." She kept her voice even. "But I'm not negotiating with you directly anymore, Warren. You forfeited that when you had me served in my kitchen." She ended the call. Her hand was steady. Everly was 8 months old by then. Sitting up on her own and deeply committed to a stuffed rabbit Becca had brought from Vancouver, and a conviction that any object within reach was improved by being placed in her mouth. Miriam watched her in the playpen that evening, entirely occupied with the structural engineering of a board book, and felt a specific joy that she didn't have a precedent for. Not the euphoric kind, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself, just sits there, in an ordinary room in January, while your daughter turns a book about farm animals upside down with complete seriousness. Elliot was there that evening. He was good with Everly in the way that some people are, not performing goodness, but just actually comfortable, sitting on the floor, following her lead, not narrating. Miriam watched him hand her the rabbit when she dropped it and thought about the infrastructure conversation at Tamara's dinner table, about the careful questions, about the phone call in December when she'd needed space and he'd just said okay. She thought about the property assessment he'd quietly obtained without asking for credit. She thought about a bridge. The function of a bridge is to connect what is separated. But more than that, a good bridge has to be able to hold weight that wasn't anticipated when it was built. The specs are the floor, not the ceiling. Elliot Hardcastle, she was realizing, was built like that. She told him so, more or less, though she put it differently. They were in her kitchen after Everly was down, the kind of late evening quiet that had become ordinary between them, and she said, "I think I need you to know that what you've been, for me, over the past few months, it's not something I take lightly." He was leaning against the counter with his coffee, and he looked at her the way he'd looked at her at Tamara's dinner table, that actual waiting. "I wasn't trying to be anything," he said. "I was just paying attention." "I know. That's what I mean." He set the coffee down. He crossed the kitchen. He was careful about it, the way he was careful about everything. And when he kissed her, she felt, underneath everything, underneath the exhaustion and the litigation, and the ordinary miracle of the sleeping baby upstairs, something that had been shut for a long time open, not dramatically, just the way a window opens on the first real day of spring when you haven't noticed how stale the air has been. Warren, in the months that followed, did eventually call Patricia's office. The access arrangement that resulted was modest and structured, and took Everly's needs as the primary consideration, which Miriam had been clear was the only arrangement she was interested in. He showed up for the first scheduled visit on a Saturday in March, stood on her front porch in a way that suggested he hadn't prepared for this particular door, and she handed him their daughter without warmth and without cruelty, because Everly was going to need a version of this that Miriam was capable of sustaining for the next 20 years. And that version required her to be decent, even when decency was the harder choice. She watched his car pull away from the window. Then she made tea and sat down and breathed. Becca had gone back to Vancouver in February, finally her visit having become the kind of extended stay that eventually stops being a visit and starts being something else. She'd found a subletter for her condo, which they'd agreed not to examine too closely. She was 3 blocks away and had strong opinions about the cream. She thought Miriam should serve with the tea, and Miriam had never been more grateful for another person's strong opinions. The mill in Dundas was approved for heritage designation in April. It had taken 16 months. She stood in the parking lot outside the building with her colleague, Fenwick Osei, a man with excellent taste in ties, and the precise, unhurried determination of someone who did this work because he actually believed in it. And they looked at the old brick face of the thing, the deep-set windows, the mortar that had been repointed so many times it was nearly a different mortar, and Fenwick said, same as it ever was, which was both true and not true, which was maybe the point. The bones, Miriam said. The bones, he agreed. She thought about a kitchen counter in January and an envelope with her name in a legal firm's font. She thought about a parking lot on King Street in the cold. She thought about a numbered ticket in a waiting room and a cream-colored bedroom and a rocking chair she'd sanded in her backyard in April while a neighbor's dog watched with tremendous gravity. She thought about a 7-pound fact of a person who smelled like something she'd never had a word for, and who now, at 10 months old, had pulled herself up to standing at the side of the playpen and looked at Miriam with an expression of total, electrified astonishment at her own capacity, at what she'd turned out to be capable of. Miriam knew the feeling. The thing about preservation, the thing she'd been trying to articulate in grant applications and heritage designation filings for 15 years, was that it wasn't about keeping something the same. Nothing stayed the same. The mortar gets repointed. The windows get reglazed. The interior gets adapted for use that didn't exist when the walls went up. Preservation was about making a decision, that the structure mattered, that it was worth the work of continuing. She'd made that decision, standing in a hospital room at 4 a.m. with a sleeping person on her chest. She'd made it in a parking lot on King Street in the January cold. She'd been making it, she understood now, in small, unremarkable ways every day since. Every cracker eaten in a parking garage, every waistband let out, every Tuesday call with Patricia, every Saturday morning coffee on James Street North, every time she'd answered the door, instead of letting the hard thing knock until she was ready to pretend it had never come. The structure mattered. She was the structure. And the bones, hers, Everly's, the quiet, new thing with Elliot that didn't have a name yet and didn't need one, the old brick mill in Dundas, the life she had not chosen but had chosen to keep. The bones were worth saving.